Okay. You guys are able to see the presentation?
Yeah. And the slides PDF you got.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Esperanza's opioid use disorder treatment program, also called medically assisted treatment, which we have had in place for about a year and a half now, depending on when you count from. It's really been a learning experience for all of us. Our patients are constantly teaching us. It's really an opportunity to be reminded of the need for humility, because you can know all kinds of medical information, but dealing with addiction, you know, for our patients, this is just a beast. And all the medical information in the world can't necessarily give you the tools you need to help them. And really, we've found that we use a group model and our patients encourage one another, and that is what's most critical. And we also, we point to the Lord from whence comes our help, right? So we'll start off with Revelation 21:5. Behold, I am making all things new. So how do opioids work? So these are both natural, and increasingly we are seeing synthetic substances that work at one of the body's opioid receptors. The mu opioid receptor is particularly the one that they are naturally occurring in the opium poppy. And years ago, there were medicines that were not really regulated before the FDA even existed, like laudanum and morphine, and heroin were actually sold as pain-relieving medications. They've been used opium has been used for centuries as a pain reliever. More recently, semi-synthetic medications such as oxycodone and hydrocodone, which is brand name Vicodin, OxyContin and Vicodin have been produced. And even more recently, there are synthetic opioids that do not rely at all on raising the opium poppy, such as fentanyl and methadone. So these have analgesic or pain relieving effects, and they have other CNS effects as well, in addition to the potential for euphoria or the high, so to speak. At lower doses, these medications decrease your pain without respiratory compromise, but as you escalate doses, respiratory compromise becomes more of an issue. And this is particularly important when you consider that with repetitive use, tolerance develops very, very quickly. If I took 5 milligrams of oxycodone, I am completely opioid naive. I have never had any opioid in my entire life. That would probably knock me flat. I'd probably sleep for 4 hours and wake up groggy. But if I gave one of my patients 5 milligrams of oxycodone, they literally would not even notice that they had taken that medication because they have developed tolerance. Tolerance is the need for an increasing amount of a substance to achieve the same effect. So going through terminology, withdrawal is that when you stop using, you feel terrible, irritable, agitated, in pain, sometimes overtly sick, depending on how long you've been using and how much you've been using. This in turn causes a desire and a craving to use again to prevent the withdrawal symptoms. Initially, you may be using opioid substances to relieve psychological pain or emotional pain, but as time goes on, you're actually using it just not to feel physically sick and in pain. So dependence is the term for that combination of tolerance with withdrawal. And addiction is really a chronic and relapsing brain disease with this compulsive drug seeking and use despite the harmful consequences. And the harmful consequences are really part of that definition of addiction. It is using until you lose your housing. It is using until you are arrested by police. It is using until you get in trouble at your job and lose your job. So what's going on in the brain is that there develops a dysregulation in the pleasure center that's deep in the midbrain. So whenever we eat good food, do something we enjoy, have a Philly cheesesteak if you're not from Philly, as long as you can eat gluten and meat and so on, but leaving that aside, you get a feeling of pleasure associated with a surge of dopamine. And the same system is activated by opiates, except much more potently and disconnected. This is important, right? Some of the things I take pleasure in, spending time with my family, laughing when my husband makes a joke, laughing when my daughter tips her canoe into the river. Some of these pleasures that I'm able to enjoy in life are relational. But the dopamine surge that you get when you shoot up heroin is totally divorced from any relational component. I enjoy a delicious meal more because I know my mother-in-law has spent time preparing it, and I can appreciate that. This is completely divorced from any relationships. So with repeated use, dopamine has been released so many times in response to that opioid that when it's missing, there's a craving to get that feeling again, and your brain adjusts so that, oh, now your body's seen that level of dopamine. Okay, your brain is assuming that that level of dopamine or something like it is always going to be there. So tolerance is developing. And then when you don't have that level of dopamine, when you have a lower level, then you feel horrible, right? Like if I eat a delicious meal, I really enjoy it and feel pleasure. But then when I am no longer eating that delicious meal, I don't feel miserable, right? Maybe I feel full, maybe I feel hungry in general, but I don't feel miserable. However, when your body is used to high levels of opioid and you take that away, you feel horrendous, indescribably awful, because the brain has become dysregulated. And with that dysregulation, with that habituation to pleasure that is completely divorced from relationships and community, patients become isolated. They will do whatever they have to do to get that drug. It doesn't matter. They will lie. They will cheat. They will steal. They will prostitute themselves. It doesn't matter. Everything else becomes secondary to obtaining that. It's not a high again, to feeling okay. That's all they're looking for at that point, is to feel okay. So as you can imagine, this breaks relationships. This breaks child-parent relationships. Think of the agony of parents whose child repeatedly, again and again and again, steals from them, lies to them, right? Is sneaking out in the middle of the house, out of the house in the middle of the night, taking their car to go get drugs, taking their money, taking their TV and selling it, right? Think of the child whose parent who was always there for them. Mom was always there. Mom was doing what moms do, being there for her child, and then falls into addiction. And it's like that mom is ripped out of their lives because they're no longer the priority. And it's even if mom loves them, and of course mom still loves them, but that addiction is so strong and so powerful that everything else just falls down the ladder of priority so far that to a child who can't understand this, it's like mom just doesn't care at all, right? So the opposite of addiction is connection, right? But these patients have become so disconnected from their families, from their loved ones, from their communities, from their churches, right? They feel disconnected from God. The pain is tremendous. So physical and emotional pain are often triggers to that initial exposure. People who are really, really well adjusted, loving family, able to provide for themselves, learned good coping mechanisms for difficult things that happen in life, have a support system, those folks are less likely to fall into heroin addiction. But that's not impossible, right? I mean, you may know people in your own life where you say, like, this is a great family. This is a great kid. How on earth did this happen? And it does. But nonetheless, there's a very, very strong link between past experiences with trauma and susceptibility to addiction. And unfortunately, opioids, especially the stronger opioids like fentanyl, like heroin, like, Dilaudid, which is a medical grade opioid. The strong ones, it's very, very frequent that the first or second use and you're hooked. I mean, that's not that way with marijuana. You can smoke pot how many times and not develop a true addiction. Even cocaine, which is more addictive, you can use cocaine a few times and you're not an addict. But heroin, once you get that hit of intense pleasure that nothing else in your life could ever hope to measure up to, it's really, really hard not to go back to that. And once you go back to it a few times, you are hooked, right? Your pain receptors and pathways have become rewired, and getting them unrewired at some level is almost impossible, right? But healing definitely is possible. I put this in kind of last minute. You don't have this in your PowerPoint presentations, but I'm going to read through this anyway. This in the Bible, to me, and I have never struggled with an opioid addiction, but having borne witness now for a year and a half to the struggles of my patient, to me, this looks like someone who is suffering from opioid addiction. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again, all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old and has broken my bones. And aside here, patients who have been long-term opioid users, we have a term in medicine, appears older than stated age. Well, these patients appear older than stated age. The opioids could cause itching. They scratch and tear at their skin. They have ulcerations, right? Perhaps they skin pop. Then they develop abscesses. They may develop osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the bone resulting in amputations. I have one patient who is missing a foot because he had an osteomyelitis, a bone infection related to shooting up into the veins of his foot. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. And that is the life of an opioid, a person who struggles with opioid addiction. It is bitterness and hardship all day and every day. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. And the weight of an opioid addiction, it's really impossible for any of those of us who have not passed through something like that to appreciate. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. These patients don't feel heard. They don't feel like there's anyone who hears them and is willing to help them because they've alienated so many in their lives so many times. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. That to me speaks about some of the physical pain that opioid persons struggling with opioid addiction. And you hear me struggling with my own words, right? Like I came through a medical residency program where we talked about drug addicts, right? I have spent 20 years in Camden, New Jersey, where my neighbors referred to other people as junkies, right? And I am still constantly re-educating myself. These are not people who can be reduced certainly to junkies. And I should not be describing them as opioid addicts, right? These are human beings. These are persons like you and I who struggle with addiction. But you're still going to hear me mentally self-correcting myself and speaking haltingly because I'm still struggling with this. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. You'll walk through our streets. You will see people who are almost on the verge of passing out. And they are doing what people colloquially call the heroin lean or the fentanyl lean, where they're leaning over in such an improbable position that you think, how can they possibly not fall over? And sometimes they do, right? And people laugh at this. You can find YouTube videos of people mocking people who are addicted to opioids, and it's heartbreaking. He's filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He's trampled me in the dust. And there's just tremendous physical degradation from the use of opioids over time. I've been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. Patients lose their jobs, their homes, their cars, their family, any money that they are able to get. They're desperate to relieve the agony that they're constantly in, right? There is no peace because once they've just used, there's that transient feeling, but it's immediately followed by shame, or so I'm told, right? And then when you're desperate and trying to get your next fix, there is just tremendous agony, pain, and shame. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I remember well them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, to the one who seeks him. I was brought up with nothing but the King James Version. So in my mind, this is programmed as the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O God. And that is the verse that perpetually comes to my mind when I go into each day working with our MAT team to try to serve people who are struggling with opioid addiction and come to Esperanza seeking help. I mentioned trauma, childhood trauma, and injected drug use as risk factors. At some point, this PowerPoint has been printed out or emailed to you. I'd like you to go through and calculate your own ACE score. So this research, and Dr. Layer can certainly talk more about this, probably far more knowledgeable than I can, came out of Kaiser Permanente health system over in California over decades of data collection, and looked at adverse child experiences and their impact on adult health, on adult mental health, on drug use, on perpetration of violence. And the results are absolutely staggering. So, you know, at some point, look where you are on this. And then I think of my patients who have come in struggling with opioid addiction and have dealt with physical abuse, childhood sexual abuse, death of a parent, imprisonment of parents, death of siblings, so much for so long, right? And they'll tell you, like, these things happen to me. They're not an excuse. Patients who struggle with opioid addiction have been through years and years and years and years of making excuses for themselves. And by the time they really, really, really want help, many of them have learned that these terrible things have happened to me, and if I use them as an excuse, I will never get out of this. So many times I have had patients describe to me horrors that I can't imagine and say, but that's not an excuse. But this is what so many of our patients are coming from. So how did we get to today's opioid crisis? As I mentioned, for centuries, people have used and misused various forms of opioids. Frequently, these were started medicinally. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup that you were encouraged to give to your children for teething contained heroin. I mean, there was flat out straight heroin that was available in bottles for folks. In the 80s and 90s, there was a big pendulum swing in the medical community where article after article talked about how incredibly safe the new narcotics were, the synthetic or semi-synthetic narcotics, the long-acting formulations. And we were encouraged. I came up through medical school being told that pain was the fifth vital sign, and I should be assessing that, and I should be treating my patient's pain. So in the 80s, there was, a letter stating that addiction was rare in patients treated with narcotics. And there were numerous studies that seemed to indicate, particularly if you used longer acting formulations like MS-Contin, OxyContin, and then used sparing doses of short acting opioids for breakthrough pain only, that this would protect your patients against opioid addiction. And I was taught this in residency. It was not until I got to Esperanza that the data really seemed to change. And I had to deprescribe long-acting opioid medications for several of my patients. In 1997, the American Pain Society and the American Academy of Pain Medicine stated still, and this is much more recent, pain is often managed inadequately despite available effective treatments. We should promote accepted principles of practice for the use of opioids. That's the system that I was trained under. But then from 2000 to 2014, and I graduated residency in 2011, the amount of prescription opioids written in the United States quadrupled. And in the same time period, deaths also quadrupled. So in those 15 years, we lost almost 500,000 American citizens, US residents. So there are particular dangers for new heroin users. As the dangers of prescription opioid abuse became clearer, we started to really abruptly decrease our prescribing. And so then the street value of the prescription meds really jumped way above the price of heroin. In Philadelphia, you can get really, really, really pure heroin. Over on the West Coast, it's black tar heroin, which is it's more dilute and it's more contaminated with other substances. You can get very, very pure heroin in Camden and Philadelphia, though. And so all of that resulted in a surge of new heroin users and heroin-associated overdose. And we saw so much of that because you could get such high-quality heroin here in Philadelphia. And then when fentanyl started becoming available, well, you already had your market of heroin users in this area, so it was a place where plenty of fentanyl was sold as well. Initially, it was mainly contaminating existing heroin. Now, a lot of what you find is just straight fentanyl. Now, we can't really tell. You'd need to get an individual sample and send it to a lab for gas chromatography where they separate out heroin from fentanyl and so on, and we don't have access to the studies to do that. And because you can't be sure of what you're getting, you may be getting heroin, you may be getting heroin combined with fentanyl, you may be getting pure fentanyl. You don't know how strong it's going to be. And you want something that's really strong that makes you feel really good, it gives you a really strong high, but then by the same token, that may kill you. So as I mentioned, Kensington for decades was a hub of heroin supply. And then it also became kind of a home for a lot of people looking for proximity to the supply, leading to settlements, squatting, open air use. It's within the last 12 months that the Campamento in Fairhill next to the Conrail Bridge was closed. And really those encampments then have moved to smaller encampments, including, as you may see, in front of the old Esperanza building at 3156, because that's got a little bit of an awning and a little bit of a shelter. You get a decent number of people camped out under there for shelter, and many of those folks are struggling with addiction to opioids. As I mentioned recently, we're dealing with a lot of HIPSOs or highly potent synthetic opioids, fentanyl, carfentanil, remifentanil. We can't really tell the difference. They're fentanyl-like synthetic products that have flooded the market, replaced heroin. They won't show up on a urine drug screen as heroin or opioid. You have to send a special test for fentanyl. I strongly recommend, if you have not read already, there is an Inky article, a Philadelphia Inquirer article called How Puerto Rico Uses a Network called the Air Bridge to Export Its Addicts to Philadelphia. I read that and just stopped what I was doing and bought an Inquirer subscription, because we were seeing this at Esperanza on a one-by-one, case-by-case basis, right? I would get a new patient and I would interview him, and I would find out that he lived in a recovery home and he was struggling with opioid addiction, and perhaps he was looking for a place to join a methadone maintenance program. And I'd say, well, okay, where's your family? Oh, they're all in Puerto Rico. All right, well, are you married? Do you have children? Are you in a relationship? Oh yeah, they're all in Puerto Rico. Like, well, who do you have here? Like, where are you living? Oh, I'm in a recovery house. Again and again and again, I would see this. And this is so, so difficult. Puerto Rico, I've never been there. I have heard. It is beautiful, just full of natural beauty. And well, you guys are at Hunting Park right now. Presumably you will visit Kensington. It grows on you, right? But if you are from a gorgeous island and you come in February to Kensington and Allegheny and you look around, I mean, that in and of itself is enough to send you into a depression, much less you are separated from all your friends, your family. You have no support system. You probably have no money. You may not speak the language. You may be able to get as far, you learn in school as far as like, where's the bathroom and I'm hungry, but that's about as far as you've got maybe, right? You're completely unmoored, separated from everything you know, struggling with an addiction. I mean, it's a horrible situation for our patients. And we've seen it again and again and again. And we were wondering, like, what is going on here? What are all these single men, single women doing from Puerto Rico? Well, they're here because of the air bridge, right? And that has been partly, maybe largely shut down. We still do see it, not as extensively as we did, but we're here to serve these folks who may not speak the language, don't have friends, don't have family here, don't have a support system. The wonderful thing is that our MAT group can function as a support system for these folks. So for years, Esperanza has worked with individuals struggling from addiction from a holistic model, and being located at KNA, which is the epicenter really of the opioid epidemic, really helped us to see on a daily basis the way in which this was impacting our individual patients in the larger community. And in 2018, looking at several MAT programs that were done by Christian and secular organizations around and outside the city, we started our own MAT program. So our program provides a formulation of buprenorphine naloxone, which is brand name Suboxone. And that is available as a pill and as a sublingual film, as well as now as an injection, although we do not yet provide the injection, which is called Sublocade. So we do weekly group visits. Those are facilitated by a substance abuse specialist, who is usually a licensed clinical social worker or a clinical social worker. Recovery skills are taught, emotional support is provided, spiritual care is offered. We offer our patients medical care, okay? But really, I think the critical part of this is patients who have struggled through addiction hold other patients accountable, right? They're not going to be pulling a fast one on their co-group attendees who have walked this path already. All the excuses that a patient can make to themselves or to other people, they're all the same excuses that the other patients have made to themselves and to other people. So they are very quick to recognize those. And what good to a patient really is me sitting there trying to encourage them when I have never walked in their shoes? It's really not much good. The medication is helpful, right? But the medication is what gives the patients the space to do the real recovery. And the real recovery and the real healing process is best facilitated by other people who have been through the same struggles. Talking a little bit more about buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is a partial opioid agonist. It relieves the withdrawal symptoms, but it doesn't give you any euphoria. It doesn't have any respiratory depression. So you can, that's not quite true. It does not have significant respiratory depression. It can have respiratory depression, particularly if you combine it with other drugs of abuse, such as benzodiazepines. Xanax would be in that category and is frequently abused, and certain sleep medications. So we have to be careful with it, but at the doses that we're permitted to prescribe, it does not cause a meaningful amount of respiratory depression. It binds opioid receptors more tightly than heroin. So if you try to use heroin while you're on Suboxone, the heroin really just doesn't work for you. It doesn't make you feel high. It doesn't make you feel significantly better. Now, massive doses can overwhelm receptors. In the hospitals, and I round in the hospital, when we have opioid patients struggling with opioid addiction who require surgery, for example, and they require opioid pain medications, we will give them Dilaudid because it has a very, very high binding affinity to the mu opioid receptor. If you give them enough, and we have to give them very high doses, it can overwhelm those receptors and have an effect. And then, fentanyl is a problem, though, because fentanyl crosses the blood-brain barrier extremely efficiently, and its binding affinity is, excuse the misspelling, is similar to that of buprenorphine. So you often need higher buprenorphine doses for a patient who's struggling with fentanyl addiction than you do with heroin addiction. And that's something that we have struggled with in our program, where our patient is using, a bundle, which is like 14 bags of fentanyl a day, and 3 strips of Suboxone of buprenorphine naloxone is just not cutting it for them. And some of those patients need to go on to methadone, where you can up-titrate the dose higher, but we're hopeful that actually Suboxone, which is the injectable buprenorphine, that will actually help us out. The buprenorphine is combined with a medication called Naloxone, which is an opioid blocker, and that's really just to prevent the manipulation of medicines into other forms. So if you chop up that buprenorphine naloxone tablet or film and you try to inhale it or you try to shoot it up, the naloxone will activate and it will prevent you completely from getting any opioid effect. Naloxone is a form of what we administer intranasally to reverse overdoses. Suboxone use is associated with a decrease in overdose deaths. I think we can confidently say that this has saved lives of many of our patients. And evidence also shows that at 6 months, a higher percentage of patients started on Suboxone remain in recovery as opposed to abstinence-based treatment alone. Now, it is critical to go through that recovery process. Just taking the Suboxone medicine is not going to be enough. Like I said, and this is really the words of Samantha Baker-Evans, who is our Associate Medical Director for MAT. The drug, the medication is what gives you the space to do the recovery. I'm not going to go into this. You can look at this on your own. I'm conscious of getting close to the end. I want to leave a little time for questions. Future directions, we are looking at the possibility of something called injectable naltrexone. That is for patients who have fully detoxed, which means that they are no longer using any opioid for weeks at a minimum, because that injection, it's related to what we give to the naloxone to reverse overdoses. That completely blocks the effects of opioids so that a patient cannot get a euphoric effect should they use. Now, there's a major challenge with getting truly detoxed, though. That is really not easy if you've used high doses of opioids for years. So this is really best used when a patient has been in a residential treatment facility, has been detoxed, they get their first dose in that program, and then we could potentially give that to them as they participate in our recovery programs so that they can maintain their sobriety. We also are going to look into this injectable depot buprenorphine called Suboxone, which is a monthly injected buprenorphine. I mentioned the pharmacokinetics of buprenorphine already, but this is a form that is given monthly. So that allows patients to go on with their lives a little bit more easily than somebody who needs to make sure that they've got access to the strips. A lot of our patients will live in homeless shelters where somebody can steal their Suboxone. Can't steal something that's been injected into somebody's arm. So there's a real benefit for that. I didn't even really go into the benefits of Suboxone, or I should try to avoid brand names, buprenorphine, naloxone over methadone. Methadone is usually given as a liquid, rarely as a pill, because it can be easily abused, in a program where pretty much you got to go every day or every other day, right? It's possible, but it's difficult to maintain a job and a functional lifestyle going in every single day. Methadone maintenance has wreaked havoc on our patients from a coronavirus standpoint. I have patients who I know how they got coronavirus. They got coronavirus because they're taking 3 buses back and forth every single day to get their methadone dose, or 6 days a week. Many of the programs are open 6 days a week. And there's a real stigma with methadone. There's not as much of a stigma for the use of buprenorphine, naloxone. So it can be more attractive to patients. There's a long number of reasons, but I want to leave a little time for questions and answers. So let me just stop talking for a minute.
Questions from the group, and you will realize, I know this is your first day, at least for some of you, your first day in North Philly. As you move around, particularly as you go to K&A, which you will get a chance to do, you'll see the gravity and the size of the problem. As Daria said, this is the epicenter of the opioid crisis on the East Coast, right here, 2 blocks that way. So we've struggled with keeping folks housed, trying to get folks off drugs, trying to prevent people getting on drugs, and opioids are the #1 culprit in this area.
I will say that we are, sorry, go ahead.
So for your MAT program, is the eventual goal to get them completely detoxed or just keep them on the Suboxone long term?
That is a very, very good question, because the patient's goal is often to wean themselves eventually off Suboxone or buprenorphine naloxone. However, the data to support that's being possible just doesn't exist, right? The longest studies of maintenance of folks on buprenorphine naloxone have shown that there is a benefit to maintaining it for 5 years compared with weaning off over 5 years. But what if the patient is on and slowly weaning down over 7 years or 10 years, and they have rearranged their lifestyle so that opioids are no longer attractive, they're no longer available, they have lots of supports in place? We don't know, because the longitudinal data just isn't there. So what we tell patients is, we're very upfront, and we tell them that. We'll tell them that the data just isn't there to reassure us that that's a safe thing for you to do. It may be, it may not be. We'll work with you, but we would encourage you, when you come into us, don't worry about that, okay? What we need to deal with right now is repairing relationships, repairing your brain's feedback loop for pleasure. When they come in, they're not able to enjoy anything, really, aside from that brief jolt from the use of heroin and fentanyl. But over time, they become able to do so, but that takes time, and it doesn't take time like weeks, months time. It takes like years time, right? So we explain that and say, listen, tapering off in 6 months or a year, we firmly believe that is not realistic, and that is likely to go very poorly for you. Tapering off over 5 years, we don't know. You could get lucky. The data isn't really there to support it. Tapering off over 10 years, let's wait. We'll see what the data shows. Let's do the work of recovery now, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about some of the stigma we have methadone use.
So part of the stigma exists because folks who need to go in for methadone have to go every day, every other day. There was a methadone center 4 blocks from my house, as a matter of fact, here in Camden. And the centers don't really do anything to reduce the stigma. They don't have waiting areas. Many of them do not. Some may, but a lot of them do not. So patients are forced to line up outside in all kinds of weather, rain, sleet, and snow. It doesn't matter, right? For potentially hours at a time. It's a miserable experience. Everybody can see you. Anybody who walks by knows. They're going into the only reason you go into that clinic is to get methadone, and they're standing out there waiting in line. They're getting methadone, right? And so part of the stigma comes from that. Buprenorphine and naloxone, on the other hand, you come to a medical appointment. Lots of people come to medical appointments. I take my kids to medical appointment, right? You can't tell that I'm going in that building for buprenorphine and naloxone as opposed to I'm going in, because I think I have a sinus infection. So there's that. And there's also just the lifestyle that a medication that is given that you take at home maybe up to 3 times a day, but you only have to go into the office for once a week. And then eventually, as our patients are progressing in their recovery, maybe they come in once a month, right? That just allows you to have a much more functional lifestyle. Other questions? I will say one area where you could really be praying for us, and we are kind of constantly in prayer about this, is we are increasingly seeing sort of polysubstance abuse. So it's not just fentanyl, it's, well, I'm also smoking marijuana laced with PCP, also known as wet. It has a couple of other names too, and I'm taking street Xanax. I feel like when we started, there was a little less of that, and now we're seeing more of that. And you know what? Like, we don't have good treatment regimens for PCP abuse. We don't really have such great treatment regimens for cocaine addiction. Benzodiazepine, like Xanax, that gets tricky because there are protocols for weaning patients off of prescribed benzodiazepines or even street benzos, but it involves using prescribed benzodiazepines, and then the insurance will not cover that with the buprenorphine naloxone because they deem it unsafe. So those are very, very, very tricky situations that our patients really struggle and we really struggle. So that would be an area where you could really be in prayer for us and for our patients.
Any other questions? No. Thank you, Dr. Chacon.
Okay. It's a privilege. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It's a privilege to have you guys here. I look forward to meeting you all. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. All right.